you said what we don't want to think of faith as something we're kind of actively doing. And I think that kind of gets us to the theology of the cross in particular, and the fact that so much of God's work in us and for us is done on us or to us. We are completely passive in it, which is very central to this idea, I would say. So, theology of the cross comes up here and there. I love that I have a Baptist about to explain theology of the cross. I love it so much, Brad. Can you tell me a little bit, like, how would you define, just in simple terms, theology of the cross for people?
The theology of the cross, I would say, understands that the suffering God is ultimately the best revelation of who God is, which is also to say that speaks to us in our own suffering, in our own lack, in our own deaths, if you will. Whereas instead of the theology or a theologian of glory would say that I think Luther terms it in the Heidelberg something like, he's always kind of looking past that to try and get behind it or beyond it.
Yeah.
I think the best way to illustrate that, at least for me, was I think this comes from Finding God in the Darkness, my book. I think it's chapter 4, which I mean, if you want like my quote unquote favorite chapter, I think it'd be chapter 4, which is where I kind of use this backdrop of like horror movies as a way in which to explain suffering, which is just to say, like, horror movies always get ruined because, the premise of the horror, whatever hook they're trying to do, always gets solved by the people who are horrified kind of figuring it out as if it's like this mystery or this clue, and they're putting things together. And I think that's often the way in which we're often viewing suffering, as if it's like this horror movie mystery that we have to solve. And if only there's this book that we can go to, and maybe sometimes that's viewed as the Bible. Here's this book that we can figure out, the mystery of suffering. When sometimes rather, like a theologian of the cross would just, I think, what's his word in the Heidelberg, where he's like, a theologian of the cross can call a thing what it is.
Yeah.
Which is to say that we're not looking behind or past or beyond that horror. We're just saying, this is where God is revealing himself to me in this, not behind it or beyond it, or so to speak. So I don't know if that's simple enough, but I think that's the best way to understand it, because it gets at this idea again of being honest about suffering and brokenness without being like over spiritual. And I think that's where a lot of the grace is found in our suffering.
Yeah. I thought A+, you did a great job as far as I understand everything. I think that, the idea that's so challenging is, and I was looking at the Heidelberg Disputation, which for those listening, is, if you have not read it, is a great place to go. It's the place to go really to see what Luther's talking about with the theology of the cross.
And definitely read, by the way, Gerhard Furdy's On Being a Theologian of the Cross.
Yes.
Because I read the Heidelberg and then I read Furdy's book, which was just immensely helpful. So definitely read
and
that.
Then also Caleb, Keith, and I did edit a tiny book called Theology of the Cross.
Yeah. I have it in my Amazon cart because I want to buy it and read it. But yes, definitely read that. I was going to shout out that one too.
No worries. It's also just a helpful companion, and Caleb did a whole new an updated translation of the Heidelberg Disputation, which I think is really helpful. Anyway, all that to say, Luther does say, I don't remember which thesis it's under, but he says God can only be found in suffering in the cross. And I was reading it today. I was like very struck by how intensely and strongly he words that God can only be found in suffering in the cross. I mean, I don't think most people would immediately, unless you're familiar with this idea, probably be like, what are you talking about? And what he means there is not that God isn't other places and that God isn't all of these other things that are not in the cross, but the way that God for us as sinners is ultimately revealed is in this ugly and hideous and grotesque place of the cross. That's where he wants us to find him. That's where he has chosen to reveal himself. And so, yeah, that example of the horror film and us trying to figure out and use our knowledge and our intellect to solve this this secret puzzle. I think Stephen Paulson talks about that all the time. Is not is not the purpose of suffering. Suffering isn't a puzzle to be solved, and it's not something to be overcome. But in our suffering, in our individual suffering, the fact that that kind of strips us away as we are just passively sitting there of all of our feats of glory and all of the ways we constantly try to ascend to the point where we say, where else can I look? And then there's the cross. That's, I think, the even though it's horrific and terrible, the beauty of this theology and this thing that is, I think, extremely comforting and extremely helpful for one who suffers, to tell them not all of these, you talk a lot about this, not all of these phrases that are kind of meant to look past their suffering, or for us to say, if it's to someone we see suffering, in order to keep us away from it, to keep us clean from their suffering, but to say to them, this is terrible. And I'm so sorry that this is happening to you.
Yes.
Yeah. And then, at some point, maybe talking about Jesus if he comes up, but that being kind of the backdrop in which we approach things.
Oh yeah. I on that point, I think it's always, I make the joke a lot that, Job's friends were amazing until they opened their mouths. Because it says that in Job, 2, I think 17, it says that they spent 7 days just weeping with Job. And then they started to have a conversation, and that's kind of where things went off the rails. But we don't always have to have this answer